Thanks so much to Jacob and Janice for inviting me to speak at this roundtable. I believe I've been invited to talk based on my experience overseeing a project called Closing the Enforcement Gap, Improving Protections for People in Precarious Jobs, which is a project that I co-directed with Mary Galatly, a community legal worker in Toronto. And then in addition, I have had a bit of a role in some of the commissions that Kevin referred to, and am currently doing some work with the ESDC Canada and looking at federal labor inspection. So I've been asked, I think, to talk about an example, to try to choose an example that relates to a kind of best practice, interesting experiment. Jacob seems to have suggested to me, so that's what I'm going to do. And there are many, and I have a lot of things to say about what's already been discussed. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about an example related to workplace inspections that I think responded, short-lived, but responded to a pressing need for proactivity with the rise of precarious employment. And so the background is this. As Kevin was saying, employee-initiated complaints, and a lot of us have found in the literature, are the foundation of most employment standards enforcement regimes, as workers are presumed to have the most stake in resolving violations. However, there's a growing recognition that, of course, that reactive enforcement is inadequate, especially with the rise of cash-strapped inspectorates and also precarious employment. There's also, I think, a mounting acknowledgement that reactive enforcement often fails to recognize workplace power imbalances. Janice has written a great deal about this, to accessing the complaint system that ultimately impede the exercise of employee voice, whereas proactive enforcement strategies may support workers by allocating enforcement resources to establish priorities. So partly in response to this recognition, in the early 2000s, in confronting a huge backlog of complaints and having underutilized a lot of workplace inspections and tools that exist in the Employment Standards Act, Ontario's Ministry of Labour, in the context of a Liberal government then in power, sought to reinvest in proactive enforcement, partly by establishing what they called the Dedicated Enforcement Team, or the DET. So the DET was responsible for conducting workplace inspections, particularly targeted blitzes, and I'll explain the different types, in industries and workplaces in which employment standards violations are endemic. And its existence contributed to an increase in the use of workplace inspections overall, and in a targeted approach in certain ways. And other jurisdictions proximate to Ontario have similar institutions. For example, Atelier and Guyane Vallée have written about Quebec's special investigation team that carries out proactive inspections, especially with temporary health agencies. And so as researchers involved in closing the gap, we were fortunate enough to interview inspectors. I think we interviewed about 120 people at all different levels. And more recently, I've done some interviews with about 25 labor inspectors at the federal level as well, which I'll sort of comment on at the end. And so we interviewed people involved in the DET and regional program managers, policymakers, et cetera, about its efficacy. And perhaps due to the multi-year duration of our project, we were also, I guess, sadly witnessed the firsthand rise and fall of the DET, much connected to the politics at the provincial level. And as far as its trajectory, the DET found its origins in 2004-05, when a report by Ontario's Auditor General found that what had become an almost exclusive focus on investigating claims and complaints was failing to protect many, many people who were filing complaints. And so in response, it made this decision to establish the Dedicated Enforcement Team. So at that time, at least 20 ESOs were assigned to conduct 2,000 to 3,000 workplace inspections each year. And so what this meant, as the slide shows, is that inspections grew appreciably between its introduction, the DT's introduction, in 2016-17. And furthermore, building on its success, the Ministry of Labour committed in 2017 to inspect about 10% of Ontario's workplaces and to hire 175 new inspectors. This did not come to fruition because the government in power was thrown out. And what ended up happening, and hence the rise and fall, was that about 70-ish inspectors were hired, and there was a halt on inspections at the end of this, the heyday of the DET. And so sadly, in the realm of proactive enforcement, things changed briefly, but not for very long. Okay, so in Ontario, there are 4 types, basically 5-ish, but 4 types of inspection. And now you can see the diagram on my slide. And some types of inspection aren't in operation currently, but in theory, they exist on the books. And so the ministry is basically empowered to conduct expanded investigations, which are investigations where someone makes a complaint and then there's a decision to expand because there seems to be evidence of more than one. There's targeted inspections, and in the case of targeted inspections, which you'll see, this is sort of my hierarchy of proactive, reactive on the right side of the screen, are inspections where the employers are pursued are often drawn from a sector. So I was sort of, as before Kevin spoke, I was thinking of long haul trucking. So, you know, one could choose a particular sector. And then there are blitz inspections, which result from campaigns directed at certain industries, slightly different, because they could be occupations or forms of work. And then there are, of course, regular inspections, which I probably needn't mention. And then there are re-inspections. And I've done some very interesting work with Becky Casey and Eric Tucker on the re-inspection front, finding that they have quite a bit of efficacy. But I won't talk as much about this. What I will say is that so situated in the middle are these regular inspections, and some ESOs in Ontario, Employment Standards Officers, talk about regular inspections not being random, and other ESOs talk about them being, completely random, as I have at the bottom in the quotation. But what is most interesting is this final type, this type of around targeted inspections. And so during the DET, the mix of workplace inspections changed during the period of the DET. And it moved more towards the reactively proactive type. So there were a lot of expanded investigations. They grew from about 10 to 29% of inspections overall in the period that we studied. And so they grew quite a bit. And then there were some really interesting and novel targeted blitzes in places like agriculture, in the temporary agency sector and such. And some of the lessons that we learned from the DET are as follows. So what we found is that there were basically, I guess, 3 strengths with the proactive strategy under the DET. One was deterrence, and we've heard a little bit about deterrence. We've heard about administrative and monetary penalties and the such. And there's one ESO mentioned, and many others did, but they tried very much, as this quotation indicates, to make it known that they were coming out. So we argue we're going to be there. We're going to look at your business. I think that's been huge, even though there's no way that we're going to hit every golf course in Ontario. The thought that we might kind of scares them and puts them into compliance. So there was this sort of deterrence effect that the ESOs and the ESO 1s and 2s and the various people that we interviewed commented on. And this was done across Ontario, and Ontario is an industrially diverse region, large geographically, et cetera. And then another of the issues that I would underline as being dealt with quite well is complex supply chains. So targeted and blitz inspections, which also grew in this period, allowed for a shift in focus away from particular firms that is often misplaced, we found, on small entities. And I know that Janice in her project is dealing with some of these questions, whose practices are shaped profoundly by firms operating at higher levels of the chain towards sectors that are operating through supply chains. And of course, David Weil has written a great deal about some of these questions. We were wanting to look at what happens with the dynamics in small firms. But the ability to address complex supply chains, I think, improved. And then violations directed at precariously employed workers, I think, were addressed more fully. So the most proactively oriented workplace inspections pursued by the DET, targeted and blitz inspections, as well as targeted expanded investigations, which I mentioned before, allow for a focus on the most precariously employed groups of workers in Ontario. And so in sectors like agriculture, these inspections were, and of course can be in the future, used to support such populations of workers that are really not in a position to complain, perhaps because of their migration status, their deportability, or perhaps for other reasons. And our research found that in the mid 2010s, when the DET was at its height, the targeted expanded investigations hybrid found violations in fully 80% of inspections. Okay, so the limit to the DET's efficacy, of course, there were limits. For example, insofar as the scope of enforcement activities, even at its height, the province only mandated the inspection of 11 core standards, which we have criticized widely because the Employment Standards Act in Ontario is much more than 11 core standards when workers have many more violations that they face. And I think as the research shows that announcing inspections, as I think Kevin alluded to certain kinds of trade-offs with which I agree, typical and regular inspections and tactical blitzes too has mixed effects. While it can deter violations, and I think I'd lean more on that, it may also warn employers in advance to clean up their books and hide various things. And inspectors talked about that to us too. And furthermore, if significant penalties aren't imposed, the promise of proactive inspections of all sorts is muted. And I would really underline that. So I think that since the DET was effectively disbanded, there has been, unsurprisingly, a return in Ontario to complaint-based measures. So during the height of the pandemic, I certainly received a lot of calls about what to do from inspectors, and concomitantly to dealing with backlogs. So there's been much more of a return to that. And this emphasis is matched, we have learned, in new research that we've just completed with labor standards officers' pursuit of enforcement of Part 3 under the Canada Labor Code, where on-site inspection is very rare. So that is in this jurisdiction, inspections are largely desk-based. So as administrative data from the Federal Labor Program at BSDC, which is in Canada, what enforces the labor standards and workplace rights of workers who work across jurisdiction in Canada. So about 10%, depending on if you include the misclassified, of Canada's workplace, to explain to those of you who are not from Canada. It shows that over 90% of violations enter the system as reactive complaints. So this problem is really quite amplified at the federal level. Moreover, the number of violations detected through proactive inspections, which again, mostly don't involve visiting workplaces, has declined over time. So it was 11% of all violations between 2006 and 2013, and our analysis of administrative data suggests that this changed, and now it's between 2014 and 2018, it's only 5%. So the types of violations prioritized during federal inspections are also different from those and quite considerably different from those uncovered through reactive complaints and investigations. While 26% of complaint-based violations relate to unpaid wages, the labor program detected an average of 9 wage-related violations per year between 2006 and 2018. So instead, it largely devotes its time and effort to inspecting for various record-keeping standards. So additionally, the labor program also tends to under-inspect in sectors relative to their share of violations entering the system via employee complaints. So for example, and here again, I have to raise this sector, it under-inspects the federally regulated industry responsible for by far the vast majority of labor standards violations, long-haul trucking. And so this has been this is I think a major challenge at the federal level. So overall, creating the DET at multiple levels to engage in multiple proactive inspections at multiple levels, I think, and creating like entities like the DET is, our research suggests, is a good idea. Despite their limits, dedicated enforcement teams have the capacity to innovate. They're, in my view, essential institutions in stemming the erosion of employment standards and their enforcement in an era of precarious employment. And of course, one central challenge that we see through the Ontario case, which, as you say, it rose and it fell, is to really institutionalize these kinds of units in inspectorates, especially where resources are really scarce. And another is to put our heads together, I think, in reimagining a workplace protection such that DETs, the equivalent dedicated enforcement teams, are really drivers of innovation. So, you know, when Kevin mentioned this example of Uber and the municipal level, one could imagine a range of strategies whereby dedicated enforcement teams are connected to institutions, but at various scales. So that's what I have to say. Thanks so much.